Alright guys, here we go. Got Program to Kill, Satanic Cover Up by Rothschilddartboard, based on
alien abductions,
Mcgowan.
wonders of the world, ancient archaeology, ghosts, apparitions, secret military projects, futuristic science, government cover-ups, hoaxes and frauds. Join us as we embark on another edition of the Paranet Continuum. Answering questions and questioning answers. Here's your host, the Director of Paranet Information Services, Michael Corbin.
And good evening and welcome to this edition of the Paranet Continuum, home of common sense, no-nonsense paranormal talk radio. Well, tonight, we're going to be talking to a guest about a book that he has just published called Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. Very interesting book indeed, and we're going to talk about that. But also, I want you to be prepared because we have a very special announcement tonight later in the hour about the future of our program. So be sure and stay tuned for that as well. So we're going to go right into this topic tonight. My guest is a radical traditionalist philosopher. He's a professional historian and novelist and a private consultant on occult and Fortean phenomena. Now, he discerns subliminal symbols in certain crimes, communications, and current events. He links ceremonial homicide and machine technology to a system of alchemical processing of humanity through the use of numbers, sights, signs, and occult wordplay. My guest tonight is Michael Hoffman. He was born at the former war capital of the Seneca Iroquois Indian Nation in the region of upstate New York, known in local folklore as the Burned Over District. The area gave birth to three major movements in world history: Mormonism at Fayette, feminism at Seneca Falls at the first Women's Rights Convention, and spiritualism in the person of the Fox Sisters of Wayne County. New Jerusalem was established in Yates County by a female seer who styled herself the Public Universal Friend. The American anti-Masonic movement began at Canandaigua, I believe it's pronounced. I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation. But anyway, without further ado, I want to welcome to the program tonight Michael Hoffman. And good evening, Michael, and thank you for joining us on the program.
Yes, thank you. It's nice to be here.
The book that you have just published is called Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. I found it to be very interesting. Give us kind of a thumbnail sketch of what the book is about.
Well, basically, I'm concerned with, as you said, the alchemical processing of humanity, the idea that in advertising, music, politics, and news, sometimes fleetingly and sometimes openly, a shadow side of reality, an underground, amoral funhouse current, which is increasingly associated with extreme sex, extreme violence, and extreme speed, is manifesting itself. And this is opposed to the static images of the suit and tie talking heads of establishment, religion, politics, and business. And the American people are gradually getting a bigger glimpse out of the corner of their collective eye of this phenomena.
Indeed.
And I think the interesting function of it is that it simultaneously produces both terror and adulation, as we're seeing that in a confluence of events and synchronicities, both connected to the NATO bombing, the tornadoes in Kansas, the Columbine school massacre. There are a number of points where we can pick this up. I leave it to you as to where you want to begin.
Well, indeed. And I a couple of years ago, I have to admit, I would have myself looked at this with my eye cocked, in a very suspicious way. But I think as things start to unfold and we see current events as they are occurring, I think people are starting to become increasingly aware that something is wrong. And that's why I found your book so very interesting. What I want to do is, I think since being here in Colorado where we're based, it'll be appropriate to talk about the Columbine school shooting. But before we do that, I want to kind of frame all of this. You mentioned earlier alchemical processing. Now, explain to us what that is.
Well, it's basically a kind of storytelling. It begins with the alchemical manuscripts, it follows up to the Rosicrucian manuscripts, and it becomes relevant to our day in various serial killer manifestos, whether they're issued by the so-called Unabomber or they're written in the form of Son of Sam letters to Jimmy Breslin at the New York Daily News. And they contain twilight language, they contain symbols, symbols, sigils, and they are then connected into the actual ritual murder sites themselves, and they become part of a ritual process, very much like the Roman Catholic Mass processes its recipients in the pew. This is a gigantic black mass that is processing people simply by virtue of them being recipients of the news or of the films or of the video games that they happen to patronize.
Now, that's a very interesting concept, because I realized I interviewed Maury Terry. I was kind of fascinated by the Son of Sam and all of that, the symbolism and stuff that went into it. And it did appear, the nation was basically taught that Berkowitz was a lone gunman, but as Maury Terry discovered in his investigation, that was quite untrue. I'm curious. Let's take the Son of Sam as an example of this. You brought it up, but how does that kind of a deal figure or factor into a black mass or that type of thing that you're talking about?
Because it's an intricately choreographed ritual, so that, for example, in the Son of Sam killings, you had the killer in his letters to Jimmy Breslin signing himself as Wicked King Wicker.
Okay.
And this was not explained or investigated by the mainstream news media, and yet that's an ancient name in witchcraft and black magic and sorcery, and it relates to the bending of reality. Now, you don't have to be necessarily erudite in those areas in order to perceive that or appreciate it or even be programmed by it, because according to Jung's theory of the collective unconscious, this is something that is recognized in our deep collective racial memory. At least if people don't want to believe that, suffice it to say that the people who are doing these so-called serial murders believe it, and that's why they are appending it onto their murders. Another aspect of it is that they came up with a sigil by Eliphas Levi, probably the most important sorcerer or black magician of the 19th century in France, and this sigil was also broadcast worldwide in connection with the Son of Sam murders. It was a cryptogram. It was a play on the name Sam Carr, even though it comes from the 19th century. Also, you will notice that in the Son of Sam murders, they signed themselves Wicked King Wicker, the rapist and suffocator of young girls.
Right.
But the method of homicide in that case was by shooting, by a Bulldog 44 pistol. There was no rape and there was no suffocation. This was a Twilight language indication to point to other rapes and murders of young girls. And in fact, the Son of Sam case is linked to both the double initial murders in Rochester, New York, and the Hillside Strangler murders. But the police and the news media overlooked the connections between Kenneth Bianchi, Michael and John Carr, and this entire network. Yet it was broadcast to the public with sufficient symbolism that there would be an apprehension and a suspicion planted, because any rational person who hears that these killers are signing themselves rapists and suffocators of young girls, and yet this is not the modus operandi in the Son of Sam killings, you're immediately alerted that something is askew. Now, when you're alerted to that, that's when they're talking to your shadow side. This is a message to your subconscious. Your dark twin is about to speak, and you're to pay attention. This is what all of this is about. It's about taking us into the mirror world and talking to our subconscious. Increasingly, this is becoming exoteric. Formerly, it was part of what the Masons call a hoodwink, an esoteric process. But it's in the revelation of the method, which is basically the final law that they need to adhere to before they take total control. They need to actually tell us what they're doing to us, and this is part of that process.
So they're basically getting people accustomed and used to various symbolisms and what those are significant or what they're attached to. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Hold that thought. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to find out, you just mentioned that the ultimate goal, and that is the title of your book, Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. We're going to find out more about that with my guest, Michael Hoffman. Also, have paper and pencil ready, because he is going to give out information as to how you can get a copy of the book and other offerings that they have, which you might find interesting as well. 1-800-836-2009, 1-800-836-2009. We'll be right back after this. I'm Michael Corbin. You're listening to the Paranet Continuum. Stand by.
fast forward and hear him. Not sure if there's more audio or what's going on here.
Corbin. And again, returning
Here
is
we
my
go.
guest tonight, Michael A. Hoffman II, and his book is called Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. And Michael, before we continue, I want to take a caller. We've got Stephen calling in from Juneau, Alaska on KINY. Good evening, Stephen. You're on with my guest, Michael Hoffman. Stephen, do we have Stephen there? Okay, well, let me put Stephen on hold and see what you guys can figure out. Michael, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you before we get into some more of this stuff on the book. Basically, then, what you're saying is we're dealing with the subject of mind control. Is that correct?
Yes.
Does this have anything to do with? I know that in your book you mentioned the Kennedy assassination and the assassination of Robert Kennedy and the others. I've talked to folks who have been, in that loop back in the 60s when a lot of this stuff was happening. Can you tell me, when they're, like, for example, Colonel Fletcher Prouty mentions the fact that the mind control issue is probably extremely serious. Are we dealing with the same kind of thing?
Well, in the sense of we're dealing with a mind control which is as old as the Garden of Eden, but we're in a new paradigm shift. We're at a level that's unprecedented.
Okay.
And one could say that it's most dramatically present now in the form of the film Matrix, which is basically MK Ultra and celluloid. Matrix is itself a virus, a processor, a type of software. It's targeted to people who have been raised with computers, who've been raised with video games. It's not really for an older audience. And it's not enough to give the kids hyperviolence and the inhuman industrial music on the Matrix soundtrack. You give them intellectual power, too. You give them a philosophy, a core teaching about reality. That's what comes out of Matrix. So we're far beyond where Fletcher Prouty was, because we continue to move this revelation of the method, this making manifest of all that is hidden,
Right.
which is at the core of both the truth or consequences scenario as well as the issue of consent. And it's all aimed at creating an enslaved robot population, but it's now being done out in the open. It was once done through an MK Ultra program in shadowy CIA corridors, but we are beyond that now because the population has become so brutalized and desensitized that the secrecy is no longer necessary. And simply by virtue of being a percipient in front of your network news, your electronic video games, or going to the movies, you are ingesting and imbibing this processing.
Now, let's talk about Columbine, because, again, I'm here in Denver. This tragedy happened right outside my back door, if you will. I mean, it's right here in the Denver metro area where this occurred. I know that from the discussion on the web by various people that those two boys that perpetrated this crime did, in fact, see The Matrix, the movie. That's what I've understood them to, that they did see the movie. And it was interesting because in the movie, the bad guys, I think, were wearing black trench coats. Is that correct?
Well, the bad guys in the movie are policemen, and the putative good guys are wearing the trench coats. They have put good for evil and evil for good in this film so that the mass murderers come out as being the so-called freedom fighters.
Okay. Now, the Columbine school shooting is one example of what you're talking about. Is that correct?
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, basically, you have a very angry and rageful generation of young white males in this country, and the process of putting them in a rage and marginalizing them is deliberate. The police state needs these actions, and then there are a number of other receptor points that also feed on this. So this is no surprise. We have NATO bombing of civilians in Serbia. It's treated like a video game. We have a exploitation of a double mind or shadow side, and then we have this calamity which is intentional. And we have children who are being processed and programmed, but it begins with their parents. It begins with an evil, rotten, filthy system that they are a part of. And since young people have a very sharp antenna for hypocrisy, they are the ones who detect it and revolt against it, whereas increasingly the population of the people in the West is becoming brutalized and desensitized, and they're content to overtly condemn it, but to continue watching it and continue to be thrilled by it. And that is indeed a process of psychological mind control, because you turn off brutalization, you turn off ugliness, you don't continue to be a part of it, you don't continue to dope yourself with approved drugs and then tell your children that they can't take the proscribed drugs while you are taking the prescribed drugs. And I'm sure you've heard that Mr. Harris was allegedly on Lovox, which is a drug similar to Prozac, just as Kip Kinkle was also on Prozac in the Oregon shootings.
Right. I've seen some very disturbing, publications concerning Prozac, and you know the reaction that people have, but the sheer number of people that are taking it. When you talk about a smaller percentage that have an ab reaction to it, you start talking about a sizable number of people.
You start talking about a sizable number of people who are being numbed, and that's the end point of where we're getting to in the revelation of the method. And these people who were overtly condemning as being monsters or so-called serial murderers, which is a neologism, and that's a subject for another time. We're condemning them, and yet actually they're the future man. There's an audience there is a group of serial killers, then there is an audience of the numb thrill seekers. We are beyond good and evil. We are inside the eye in the triangle, which is what that symbolizes. I am above duality. And the more that we talk about and condemn these things without changing anything in our society, the more passive and apathetic we become, and the more we guarantee that our double-mindedness will continue. So that we look to people like Marilyn Manson, we seek them out as scapegoats, when Marilyn Manson is simply a mirror of these children's rage. All of this is intentional and deliberate. Al Gore has praised The Matrix as being a very fine film. It's out in the open, and what really counts now is what we do about it in reaction to this.
Okay, let's try to get that caller up, and then I want to find out what we do about it. Hold on. Stephen, you're on with my guest, Michael Hoffman. Are you there?
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
I was curious what your guest philosophy was concerning the organization of the Masons. If you could explain that, and I'll hang up and listen.
Okay, thanks, Stephen.
Well, the Masons have largely been superseded now, because with Virtuoso they have accomplished all the major tasks that have been assigned to them. So we are in the post-Masonic age. But certainly Freemasonry and the history of the United States have been in many cases synonymous. That's not to say that there haven't been populist revolts against the Masons, but in the manufacture of consent that is going on the part of establishment news media and colleges and universities, we hear very little about these revolts. And in fact, they largely were unsuccessful after they waned in the mid-19th century. But yes, Freemasonry has been instrumental in twisting and turning the United States into what it has become, this amoral funhouse, and it is the great manipulator of symbols, and indeed it has at its core the Twilight language principle, which it symbolizes as a figure known as Dr. Syntax, as in the principle of grammar, who lectures at Freemasons Hall. So this is all very important, but Freemasonry is largely now exists to suborn jurors and to help people commit petty crimes, or perhaps even to hide some assassins. But its central, pivotal role is now largely diminished, because it has in fact been too successful. So people can look around to their local communities and see that the local Freemasonic lodge is either folded, or it's often headed by a janitor or a plumber, whereas in decades past it was usually the leading doctor or lawyer in the town who was the master mason. So we are in basically an era beyond Freemasonry, and I talk about that in my book, How Far We Have Deteriorated.
Okay, Michael, hold that thought. We got to take another break. When we come back, I want you to give out information about how folks can get a copy of the book and further information about it, okay?
Yes.
Michael Hoffman is my guest. The book tonight we're talking about is Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. Stay tuned. There's more to come. I'm Michael Corbin. You're listening to the Paranet Continuum. We'll be right back.
Some of the things you'll hear on this program are simply unbelievable. But what if they're for real? Keep an open mind and stay tuned to the Paranet Continuum. with your host, Michael Corbin.
And welcoming back my guest tonight, Michael Hoffman. The book is Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. And Michael, you've mentioned that unless somebody starts doing something to reverse this, this only helps to serve their end. What can people do to reverse this? What can happen to stop this?
Couple of things. First, you have to stay separate from these things. We started out in 1960 with Michael Powell's film The Peeping Tom about the voyeuristic thrills of a random murderer, or is now called serial killer. And Scanners in 1980, we had The Exploding Head, and Videodrome in 1983, we had Lurid Sex and Death. We've got Matrix in early April debuted. We had Idle Hands debut in the movie theaters 10 days after the Columbine Massacre on April 30th, glorifying teenage murder rampages. Star Wars is coming up later on in 1999, which shows monsters as being friendly in our stores. If you go into record and bookstores now, you see pictures that you could identify years ago as being largely demonic, and they're associated with good figures. So we're having a total reversal of good and evil here. It's what the Arthur C. Clarke predicted in his very prescient book, Childhood's End, and that this would be that we would have these satanic figures walking amongst us, and there would be absolutely no protest. A couple of things before I go I'd like to mention. One is that last month in Spokane, Washington, the police chief named an FBI agent as a suspect in a series of serial murders in Spokane. And you will recall that the new Hannibal Lecter book, the sequel to Silence of the Lambs, is going to have the FBI agent teaming up with the serial murder. Quite a synchronicity there. Also, I believe NBC this evening is broadcasting the Unicorn Killer, a program about the Unicorn Killer.
Ira Einhorn, right?
That's right, but the actual Twilight language there relates to Charles Ng, who last week had his penalty phase in which they sentenced him to death. He's the man who, with Leonard Lake, did those gruesome torture murders in California that were filmed and then sold on the snuff film circuit. Well, it's Leonard Lake who's the real unicorn man, because Leonard Lake was the keeper of the unicorn for the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. And I'm not suggesting here that Ringling Brothers is in any way involved or culpable, but it's a very interesting confluence of symbols. To answer your question, I'll quote Frederick Douglass: "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." And I would say that as long as we endure these things and we fail to separate ourselves from them, and we fail to both protest and attempt to bring the guilty parties to justice and to be prosecuted, then we will have a hellish society imposed on us, and we will have Satanism as the official state religion of the United States. Not from some caped crusader on a stage with long fangs, not a Marilyn Manson type. The Satanism is being practiced by Al Gore. It's being practiced in places where we tolerate 37 million aborted babies, where we tell a girl who's a teenager that she should abort her baby and murder it, but she can't smoke a cigarette while she's doing it. It's that level of absurdity that is generating this rage in these kids, and it's the adults who are responsible. The satanic society begins with the suits and ties, and it can be found in our police departments, in our government, and in our news media.
That's a very powerful statement. And indeed, I think a lot of people are starting to wonder, just how much of all this is true, in light of a lot of things that have occurred just in this year.
Yes, it's been a very important year for these kind of shocks, and they will then quiet things down a little bit and have it kind of seep into the subconscious, and then they'll process us through the next thing. We basically know what they're doing to us now. It's not a case of trying to reveal so much as getting the people who already know what's going on to stand up and protest, and to create a separate system of our own where we can begin to educate people and create our own communities. That's the great prophylactic against this, but I'm not seeing it so much because the entertainment factor is coming to the fore. war. With an amoral or an immoral population, a great deal of this is simply grist for the entertainment mill.
Yeah.
And they're both mesmerized and entertained by it. And it's a very sick phenomenon.
It's sad.
It happens by the same people who are decrying violence on the news, like Sam Donaldson, and then their network switches to a commercial for a hyper-violent film. Of course, Matrix is a lot more than violence. It involves a simulated LSD trip. It involves subliminals. So we're at another level here. But it all comes down to a brutalization, and I ask people if they really want to defend themselves against it to remain separate from it. Not simply to counsel your children not to do it, but they go not so much by precept but by example. What is your example to them? Are you separate from this garbage and this insanity and this brutalization?
Very good advice.
And you can ask them to be as well. If you want me to give you the details on ordering my book,
Yes, please do. We're out of time.
$15 post-paid from Independent History, Box 849, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The zip is 83816. My website is www.hoffman-info.com.
Very good. Michael, I want to thank you very much for being on the program. Very important material indeed.
Thank you.
And take care, okay?
You too.
Thank you. Michael Hoffman, that was my guest, and the book is Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. Very interesting topic. Now, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I've got a very special announcement, so also have pen and paper ready, because we will give you out some other information, too, coming up. We'll be right back after this. I'm Michael Corbin. This is the Paranet Continuum.
Yeah, of course they cut it.